December 1990, Tokyo. Between the crowded, neon-lit streets of the Japanese city and the rattling noise of its Shinkansen, an internal war was being fought in the homes of all children and adolescents around the world. Not a war with missiles or tanks, fortunately, but a war between two icons and two video game companies for cultural hegemony and sales. Mario vs. Sonic, Nintendo vs. Sega. Welcome to this experiment, a journey between pixels and philosophy. A format that starts from the 8-bit era and will arrive, one day, at the PlayStation 3. I'm Steve, this is the year 2080, and I'm an archaeologist and collector of technology of the 21st century. In this journey, we will explore the video game and media oddities and the socio-cultural aspects related to them, of this crucial period of history that so many people believe to have been the pinnacle of human creativity. At the end of the 20th century, video games had not yet become an integral part of the reality in which we live. Most people in those days still lived a completely analog life. But we can certainly say that video games were already present in the lives of all children and teenagers of the time. Not yet as a full-time activity, or in a learning or school context, but as a social gesture and meeting. In fact, video games were still mostly relegated to specific computers for their reproduction that took care of the hardware and software processing and also the recording of a local register of the score to that game. These machines, of very large size and cost, with their strange interface peripherals, were called cabinets and furnished arcades all over the world. I personally remember with great nostalgia the long afternoons in a group with schoolmates in these large game rooms where they could play and compete in a competition of skill with points or direct defeat. The game limit was mostly dictated by how many coins you wanted to put in the cabinet. But we're talking specifically about 1990, and at Christmas of that year, an item was on a lot of children's letters to Santa. A console different from the previous ones, destined to change the world gaming landscape. I'm talking about the Nintendo Entertainment System, which you see here. A lot of games with very simple graphics by today's standards were only playable locally by one or maximum two players at the same time through the use of these simple control interfaces. Each game, mostly two-dimensional graphic and action platforming adventures with a very stylized look, offered its own very simple version of the hero's journey, but without weaving too complex plots. The hero of heroes on this console was undoubtedly Super Mario. I still remember the amount of hours spent between my brother and me trying to complete at least the first few levels. In fact, a characteristic of the first video games of home consoles was linked to the great replayability, the simplicity of the game mechanics and above all the difficulty of completing the various game segments, which mostly I have always had the impression that they had to be memorized, almost like learning to play a musical instrument. Still in Japan, however, the other big video game and cabinet production companies did not stand by and quickly understood what was the method behind the creation of a character like Super Mario. Among all, Nintendo's biggest rival at that time in Japan was certainly Sega, which had already contended for years for the monopoly of sales both nationally and worldwide with the Master System console, and that the following year wanted to take away the title at the same time with the launch of a new console and a new star and mascot of their video game empire. That year Sega launched a truly historic marketing campaign, deploying in Christmas 1993 in Japan and the United States a bundle with the new console, the Sega Genesis, now with a new 16-bit processor, and their most important launch game, Sonic, which we will talk about shortly, at a price that competes with the old Nintendo console. The transition to a 16-bit graphics processor, which allowed much more advanced and complex graphics and game mechanics, and a much higher number of images and screen elements, then turned out to be a revolution both in terms of sales and also from the point of view of the history of video games. With games with much more complex and developed graphics, developers could now focus on creating stories and worlds that also targeted other demographics. Games could now finally adhere to genres with well-defined and recognizable aesthetic canons and therefore deal with themes and contents no longer only for children. In the following months, the Sega marketing division in the United States invented a very aggressive advertising campaign to definitively defeat the old Nintendo Entertainment System, and in the middle of the following year Nintendo was forced to launch its next console, already ready and even sold in limited edition, only in Japan, even if the original internal plans were to release games for the NES for years in the United States, based on popular film and comic book franchises, such as Ghostbusters and Spider-Man. The advertising campaign read, "Sega does what Nintendo don't," referring to the increased performance of their console, and showed the Nintendo console on video as it was thrown, along with other 16-bit consoles, into an old bin with the word toys written on it. This reveals Sega's real intention to open up a video game market to consumers of more mature age groups, as already mentioned. But all this effort on the part of Sega, perhaps it would not have been worth it to be able to compete with the giant Nintendo, which in those years had an established consensus as an industry leader, if there had not also been the creation of a character with a lore and an aesthetic capable of rivaling in iconicity and style with Super Mario and grabbing the hearts of millions of children, but above all of adolescent boys. Sega worked for more than a year with the best designers in the Japanese video game and cartoon market to invent Sonic, a new mascot. Sonic was a stylized character representing a blue humanoid hedgehog with iconic red sneakers. This character would run at the speed of sound through dangerous platforming levels filled with ramps and platforms that could launch or roll him to hit enemies. The game's aesthetics were futuristic and the mechanics were revolutionary compared to the Super Mario games. While Mario could go from left to right to complete a level, facing enemies one at a time, Sonic could explore each level and defeat enemies and recover points, in a non-linear way, literally jumping from one side of the level to the other in an instant. Thanks to the capacity of the new hardware, the design of the Sonic character actually featured a primary color palette very similar to that of Mario, but while the latter, for some reason, had a gentle voice and tone and with a vague Italian stereotype, Sonic was a character who came from another dimension and had a much more edgy and cool tone and way of speaking, which resonated a lot with the extreme culture of the young people of that decade. And here, we finally get to the gist of what I wanted to talk about in this video, that is, the social and philosophical connotations that the two characters and the two production companies embody in their video game conception, in an all-round picture. So we see that Mario is a character created almost by accident, based on the technological limitations and representative of the previous generation of consoles. The few pixels on the screen offered very little space for articulated representations and much was still left to the imagination of the player. Mario had a thick mustache and a hat with a visor, trousers that could look like a plumber's overalls, and moved from one level to another passing through large man-sized pipes. Really, there were not many other elements to connote him as a character, and therefore the players guessed that he could be a sort of middle-aged Italian plumber. How this type of character fit into a story of castles, dragons, and princesses was entirely left to the imagination. Sonic the Hedgehog, on the other hand, could count on a graphic sector, but above all on much more refined world-building techniques, as a character. With the release of 16-bit consoles, developers had now gained much more sophisticated techniques and knowledge. And after all, Sega had already tried years earlier with two characters on its Master System. Alex Kidd and Wonder Boy in Monster Land offer very coherent, recognizable characters and game worlds and, all in all, remain quite iconic, at least among retro gaming enthusiasts like me. Sonic is therefore to all intents and purposes an icon created at the table, without the participation of the imagination of the players. Strengthened by total aesthetic, mechanical and content control, Sega was able to create a more coherent character and therefore more serious and more refined. This gave players of the time a sense of greater empowerment than hopping here and there on the heads of enemies such as Mario, Sonic, which was also a game with more complex mechanics, and at a first try, less understandable and more complicated. Once mastered, gave a sense of greater power to the player, as he could get rid of his enemies very quickly, thanks to its speed, its special move and, above all, the player's reflexes. From a certain point of view, we could also reflect in another way on this comparison between Mario and Sonic, saying that Mario is a character with an almost random aesthetic that serves to act as a bridge or simple interface and provide the player with a series of simple mechanics, for a casual platform adventure, whose immersion is given precisely by the cognitive immediacy of the game and the player's sole desire to suspend his judgment and spend some time now in the game without too many pretensions. Sonic, on the other hand, is aimed at an audience of players who have already internalized this type of experience and want more, a more defined game world, with more complex mechanics and rules and with a higher level of challenge and difficulty. This increased tension ultimately gives the player a greater sense of satisfaction once they have completed a segment. But Sonic, from the point of view of subtext, also has another aspect to consider. Sonic is, in fact, in all respects a competitive game, ableist, with an arcade spirit that collects the history of Sega up to that point, In Sonic you cannot win if you are not able to understand and master the mechanics of the game at all times. It is a challenging game of skill. It is not an adventure that can be won with calm, patience, and perseverance. Obviously, this dichotomy of the world of video games is not only noticeable in this comparison, but has been present since the dawn of the birth of the sector. In reality, playing and playing are two human activities that have always been very close and correlated in human behavior, and the world of video games, as an expressive language, inherits their characteristics. But Mario and Sonic are just two iconic incarnations of these two sides of human expression. So a game is a game of skill that favors players who somehow have more developed skills than others. While Mario is more almost like a character in a fairy tale who, jumping and twirling, somehow manages to save the princess from the dragon, in a very reassuring way. I also found it very interesting that at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, both characters were chosen as mascots of the event, as if to suggest two ways, the artistic/performative one and that of direct competition, of conceptualizing sport. Personally, I have always had the feeling that Nintendo always puts children first as a target audience, and that it makes sure that all their products are interconnected in a sort of colorful multiverse for children. I do not say this in a negative way at all. On the contrary, I approve and appreciate the effort of this developer to always maintain a very high quality control and congruence of their products, not only from an aesthetic point of view, but also from a cognitive and perhaps even educational point of view. I believe that from this point of view Nintendo is even better and more consistent than Disney with its universe. However, I also think that Nintendo video games are more almost toys than video games in the true sense of the word. Considering the linguistic roots of the term, Super Mario, as a game, maintains an ethos of to play. The video game is an extension of the toy, continuity with material culture. It is no coincidence that Nintendo was born as a playing card company. The to play is a way of relating to the world that accepts slowness, error, deviation. And don't get me wrong, Nintendo has had dozens of opportunities to contradict me with what I'm telling myself. Games like Luigi's Mansion or the latest Zelda titles are certainly complex and structured world building, and the mechanics are complex and well polished. But when we think back to Nintendo's most popular games, Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Mario Kart, Super Smash Bros., Pokemon, they seem to me more like toys that a child can play with, meant to be played, to develop their imagination, rather than to passively watch or immerse themselves in a game. Really, I say this as a compliment, not to despise. Sega, with Sonic the Hedgehog, changes the tone. It doesn't invite you to play with Sonic. It invites you to play Sonic. The verb changes regime. The experience is less sandboxing and more performance. The implicit stopwatch, the speed, the score, the efficiency of the trajectories. It is closer to the legacy of arcades, where the economic model imposed intensity, difficulty, spectacle. The arcade is pure game, strict rules, challenge, quick death, repetition. So why is it that, in the world of video games, since the release of the 16-bit generation, we have perhaps begun to appreciate more this design attitude designed to look cool and that favors a more defined world building? Why does the player prefer games with a cinematic aesthetic and stories that leave less room for imagination? Perhaps the inclusion of older age groups has led to the development of an orientation more towards realism than towards the imaginative? For Jean Baudrillard, the object in the consumer society does not possess a single value, but at least four superimposed levels. The use, or function, value is what the object does. A console allows you to play. A shoe allows you to walk. Exchange value is its price in the market, its economic equivalence with respect to other objects. The symbolic value concerns the social bond, the gift, the belonging, the relational meaning that the object takes on within a community. Finally, there is the sign value. It is the status, the social difference that the object communicates. Not what it does, but what it means. Not the technical function, but the cultural position it assigns you. In post-industrial society, according to Baudrillard, it is the value of sign that dominates. Objects compete not only by utility or price, but by symbolic difference. They become identity markers. Then Sonic would also be interpretable today almost as a parody of how myths are built in the capitalist era, a true postmodernist icon. According to Baudrillard, a simulacrum is, in the technical sense he gives to the term, a sign that no longer refers to a stable real referent, but only to other signs. Baudrillard distinguishes, schematically, between representation and simulation. The representation refers to something that exists outside the symbol itself. Simulation, on the other hand, produces an autonomous and interactable or observable reality. When the sign or symbol no longer copies reality but precedes and replaces it, we enter hyperreality. Sonic, in this picture, does not represent a hedgehog. It doesn't even represent physical speed. It is not a symbol of real youth rebellion. It is an artificial condensation of signs of 90s coolness, running shoes, ironic grimace, inclined posture, constant acceleration. It is a semiotic collage designed to function as an icon of an attitude in productivism or competition. There is no original behind him. There is no fast hedgehog in the real world to reference. Sonic's speed is already a graphic, sound, algorithmic effect. It is a corporate construction that simulates authenticity, rebellion, and spontaneity. His attitude is not the reflection of a subculture, it is a prefabricated subculture. Sonic is a real iconic construct, assembled with symbols taken from other parts and is understandable only by considering and knowing the meaning of the symbols themselves. For example, in her design, the sneakers are represented with caricaturally large proportions and, even assuming that an anthropomorphic creature could really exist, those shoes would be perfectly in the way of her running. But they are to be considered a symbol that takes over among the characteristics of the character. Interestingly, this paradigm shift coincides with the early 90s, with a culture more obsessed with speed and competition, with productivity. The transition from toy to performative device is not neutral. It is a change in the way the medium conceives the subject, from a child who manipulates a world to a cognitive athlete who must dominate it. In late-stage capitalism, sign value tends to masquerade as function value. A console isn't just sold for what it does technically, but for what it promises to be. Faster, more powerful, more adult, cooler. The language of performance becomes moral language. This is where corporate ableism comes in, the systematic glorification of speed, reactivity, and power as intrinsic virtues. Not just technical characteristics, but desirable qualities of identity. During the console war between Sega and Nintendo, Sega often built campaigns that elevated the value of the sign to the primary criterion. Blast processing, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. They were not just technical claims. They were affirmations of identity. The implicit promise was, choosing this console makes you faster, more mature, more competitive. The sign of power was perceived as a real function. The symbolic difference was internalized as technical superiority, even when the hardware distance was less dramatic than the marketing suggested. In this mechanism, the consumer does not only buy a car, but an image of himself. And the sign value ends up prevailing over the use value, while continuing to present itself as if it were pure functional data. From a Baudrillardian point of view, Sonic does not represent speed, he replaces it in everything. The player is not running, but experiences hyperspeed mediated by pixels and FM sounds, coding symbols, in turn. It is a simulacrum of speed, faster than real speed, because it starts from the assumption that, through the symbol itself, the spectator suspends the comparison with experience in favor of the absorption of pure meaning. The sensation is more intense than the physical experience. In this sense, Sonic is already postmodern. He is not a coherent anthropomorphic animal, he is a sign surface designed to evoke coolness. His attitude precedes his psychology. It is a sign that refers to other signs, MTV, skate culture, 90s advertising. The famous attitude is pure marketing construction. Sonic is a character who seems rebellious but is born in a boardroom. Prefabricated rebellion. This is Baudrillard in its purest state. Transgression is a product. Sonic the Hedgehog is also a temporality device. Its speed compresses time. The player is forced to react, not to contemplate. It is an aesthetic of immediacy. If the 8-bit culture still had something artisanal, the 16-bit culture inaugurates the frenzy of the permanent update. Okay, that's it for today. Let me know in the comments what kind of players are you. Do you prefer single-player games that prefer the story? Or competitive games, perhaps MMOs? Or do you prefer to explore meticulously constructed worlds like in RPGs and JRPGs? And what platform do you play on? Let me know in the comments. And I recommend like and subscribe. Thank you.
This program was released and met with a considered the autocratic body for the supervision of information and public opinion and is passed to the future review. We hope we have entertained and amused you and maybe a little interested in the structuralist approach of the video game medium. See you again in the next episode. Bye bye.